It is the 12th of April, 1945, and 3 American generals are walking into a place that will change at least one of them for the rest of his life. They have come to a camp near the German town of Ohrdruf, in the heart of a Germany that is collapsing all around them. And even before they pass through the gate, the smell reaches them, a smell that men who were there would never be able to describe and never be able to forget. Inside the wire is a silence that is worse than any noise, and inside that silence is the evidence of what has been done here. The 3 generals are among the most powerful soldiers in the world. Between them, they command millions of men and the machinery that is grinding the German war to its end. And as they move through this camp, something happens to them that no battlefield ever did. One of them, the most famous fighting general in the American Army, a man who has driven his tanks through the worst combat of the war without flinching, a man who prides himself on his hardness, cannot bear it. He grows physically sick. He turns away. There is a building he will not enter because what is inside it is more than even he can face, and he steps aside to be ill. This is a man who has seen death in every form the modern battlefield can produce, and this place undoes him. The second general forces himself to do the opposite. He makes himself walk through all of it. He makes himself look at every hut, every pile, every piece of evidence, refusing to spare himself a single detail, his face gray and set. And when he has seen all of it, he does not simply grieve, and he does not simply rage. He does something that reveals a kind of foresight almost no one else in that moment possessed. He gives an order, several orders in fact, and the orders he gives, standing in that camp on the 12th of April, 1945, have nothing to do with the war that is nearly over, the war against Germany. They have to do with a different war, one that has not started yet, a war that will be fought for decades after every soldier in that camp is dead. The war over whether the world will believe this happened at all, and whether the memory of it will survive the people who saw it. That general is Dwight Eisenhower, and the order he gives that day may be one of the most important things any commander did in the entire Second World War, not because it won a battle, but because it may be the single greatest reason that, all these years later, the truth of what the Nazis did cannot be argued away. If you are new here, stick around, because this is a story about a different kind of courage than the kind we usually tell. Not the courage to charge a hill, but the courage to look at the unbearable and refuse to turn away, and the wisdom to understand, in that moment, that the truth itself would one day need defending. But to understand the order Eisenhower gave, you have to understand what the American soldiers found when they first walked through that gate, 8 days before the generals arrived, and you have to understand why a man standing in that place in April of 1945 would already be thinking about liars who had not yet been born. So let us go back to the beginning of it, to the first time the United States Army came face to face with the thing the whole war had secretly been about. By the spring of 1945, the American armies were driving deep into Germany itself, and rumors had been reaching them for a long time. Rumors of camps, rumors of mass murder, rumors of something being done to the Jews of Europe, and to others the Nazi regime had marked for destruction on a scale that the ordinary mind refused to accept. Soldiers had heard things. Intelligence had gathered things. There were reports, and there were whispers, and there was the strange, half-believed knowledge that floats through an army about horrors it has not yet seen with its own eyes. But there is an enormous distance between hearing a report and standing in the place the report describes. And for the American soldier, that distance closed for the first time at Ohrdruf. It is worth pausing to understand why the reports had been so hard to fully believe, even for the men whose job was to gather them. The thing the Nazi regime had done had no precedent in the experience of the ordinary American soldier, or really in the experience of most human beings who had ever lived. Across the Chai years of the war, the Nazi state and its collaborators had carried out the deliberate, organized murder of millions of people, the systematic destruction of the Jews of Europe above all, alongside the mass killing of others the regime had condemned. Political prisoners, prisoners of war, the disabled, Roma, and more. It was not the violence of battle, and it was not even the ancient horror of a massacre in the heat of conquest. It was something colder and more modern than that. Murder organized like a factory, planned in offices, scheduled on timetables, carried out by a bureaucracy. That kind of evil is almost impossible to imagine before you have seen its results, precisely because the mind recoils from believing that human beings would build such a thing on purpose. And so, even soldiers who had read the intelligence reports carried, somewhere inside them, a protective disbelief, a sense that surely the reality could not be as total as the words suggested. Ohrdruf stripped that disbelief away in an afternoon. It replaced the words with the thing itself, and once a man had seen the thing itself, he could never again take shelter in doubt. Ohrdruf was a camp near a town of the same name in the German region of Thuringia, one node in the vast Nazi network of camps, a forced labor camp connected to the larger, more infamous camp system, a place where prisoners had been worked, starved, and killed. And in the first days of April 1945, as Patton's Third Army swept through the area, the soldiers of an American armored division and an American infantry division reached it and went inside. It was, so far as the record shows, the first camp of its kind that the United States Army liberated, and what those soldiers found there broke something in them that no combat had touched. The men who came through the gate first were combat troops of Patton's fast-moving spearhead, armored soldiers and infantry who had been fighting their way across Germany at high speed, chasing a disintegrating enemy. They had expected perhaps another cluster of buildings to be cleared, another position to be secured. What they walked into stopped them cold. There was no enemy left to fight. The guards had fled, leaving their crime behind them. There was only the aftermath laid out in the open, and a handful of survivors so wasted by starvation and disease that the healthy young Americans could hardly believe they were looking at living people. Those few survivors and the dead all around them told the whole story without a word needing to be spoken. And the soldiers who had come expecting a military objective found instead a moral one, a scene that would rearrange their understanding of the war they were fighting and the enemy they were fighting it against. Many of them would say for the rest of their lives that whatever they had thought the war was about before Ohrdruf, they understood it differently afterward. Some of them, decades later, still could not speak of it without breaking down. It was the kind of thing that does not leave a person. It moves in and stays. I am going to describe what they found with restraint, because the dignity of the dead demands it, and because the point of this story is not to dwell on horror for its own sake. But the truth has to be told plainly, or the rest of the story means nothing. The Americans found the dead. They found bodies, many of them, the bodies of prisoners who had died of starvation and disease and exhaustion, reduced to a condition that the healthy young soldiers who found them could not comprehend. And they found worse than that, because they found evidence of deliberate killing. As the German guards had fled ahead of the American advance, they had murdered many of the prisoners who remained, men too weak to be marched away, shot where they lay or gathered and killed so they could not be liberated to tell what they had seen. The Americans found the results of that. They found the place where bodies had been burned in an attempt to destroy the evidence, the Germans having tried, even at the very end, to hide what they had done. There were only a handful of living survivors, skeletal and barely clinging to life. The rest was death, and the machinery of death, and the smell of it, and the silence. That detail, the attempt to destroy the evidence, deserves to be held up against everything that came afterward, because it frames the whole struggle over memory that this story is really about. Even in the final days, even as their world collapsed around them, those who ran the camps understood that what they had done was a thing to be hidden. They tried to erase it. They burned. They buried. They marched the surviving witnesses away. They fled ahead of the advancing armies, hoping to leave nothing behind that could be understood. The instinct to destroy the evidence is itself a confession. You do not try to hide what you are not ashamed to have the world see. And so the fundamental battle was joined right there in those first hours before any general arrived. On one side, the desperate effort to make the truth disappear, and on the other, once the Americans walked in, the growing determination to make it permanent. Eisenhower's orders were the direct answer to that attempted erasure. Where the perpetrators had tried to burn the record, he ordered it photographed and filmed. Where they had tried to remove the witnesses, he created thousands of new ones. Where they had counted on the world's disbelief, he manufactured belief on an industrial scale. It was erasure against permanence, forgetting against memory. And at Ohrdruf, permanence and memory won. Battle-hardened American soldiers, men who had fought their way across a continent and seen their own friends killed, walked through Ohrdruf and wept and vomited and stood in stunned, disbelieving silence. Some could not speak for hours. These were not soft men. They were combat veterans, and they had thought there was nothing left in the world that could shock them. They were wrong, because a battlefield, however terrible, is a place where armed men fight armed men. This was something else entirely. This was the calculated, industrial destruction of the helpless, of the starved, the unarmed, the sick, the condemned, carried out coldly as a matter of policy by a modern state. There was no category in the mind of an ordinary soldier that could hold it. It was a new thing in the world, or at least a thing on a scale the world had never been forced to see, and Ohrdruf was where America saw it first. Word of what had been found went up the chain of command with unusual speed and force, and it reached the very top. And here we come to the decision that sets this story apart, because when General Eisenhower heard what was at Ohrdruf, he did not do what a busy supreme commander in the final weeks of a world war might easily have done. He did not read the report, shake his head, and move on to the next crisis. He decided that he had to see it himself. And on the 12th of April, 1945, he traveled to Ohrdruf, and he brought with him two of his most senior commanders, General Patton and General Bradley, so that they too would see it with their own eyes. Think about that choice for a moment, because it was deliberate and it was unusual. Eisenhower did not have to go. There was nothing a supreme commander needed to accomplish at a liberated camp that his subordinates could not handle. He went because he judged that it mattered for the men in his position to bear personal witness, to be able to say, ever after, not that they had been told, but that they had seen. And he brought Patton and Bradley for the same reason. He wanted the leadership of the American Army in Europe to carry this in their own memories, to be witnesses in the fullest sense. What happened during that visit tells you as much about the men as it does about the place. Patton, George Patton, the hardest and most aggressive fighting general America had, the man we have watched cross the Rhine and drive his armies through the worst the enemy could offer, could not take it. By the accounts of that day, the sights at Ohrdruf made him physically ill. There was a part of the camp, a building holding some of the worst of it, that he could not bring himself to enter. He stepped away and was sick. Understand what that means. This was a man who had seen more death than almost anyone alive, who had built his entire identity on being unshakable, on being the one who did not flinch. And Ohrdruf made him flinch. It reached past every layer of hardness he had spent a lifetime building and struck something underneath that even he could not armor. There is no shame in it, quite the opposite. That the toughest general in the Army was undone by this place is itself a kind of testimony to what the place was. Some things should sicken a human being. The failure would have been to feel nothing. Bradley, the third of the generals, was likewise stunned into a kind of appalled silence. He was a calm, measured man, not given to dramatic reaction, and by the accounts of that day, even he was left speechless by what he saw, struggling to find any words at all for something so far outside the bounds of anything he had encountered in a lifetime of soldiering. So there they were, the three most senior American commanders in Europe, men who among them had planned and led the greatest campaigns of the war, who had sent hundreds of thousands of men into battle, who had grown accustomed to death on an enormous scale, and all three were brought up short, each in his own way, by Ohrdruf. One was physically sick, one was struck dumb, and one, Eisenhower, went pale and rigid and made himself keep looking. That these particular men, of all men, were affected so profoundly is part of the historical record for a reason. Their reactions are themselves evidence. When the hardest, most experienced soldiers in the American Army recoil from something, that recoil tells you that you are looking at something categorically different from ordinary war, a horror that belongs to its own dark category, apart from anything a battlefield produces. And Eisenhower did the harder thing, which was to look at all of it anyway. He forced himself to tour the entire camp, to examine the evidence directly, to deny himself the mercy of turning away. His face, by the accounts of those present, went pale and rigid, but he did not stop, and he did not spare himself. He looked at the dead and at the manner of their dying and at the machinery that had produced it, deliberately, completely. And it was out of that act of forced, unflinching witness that his foresight was born. Because as he stood there taking in the full reality of it, Eisenhower's mind did something remarkable. It reached forward past the end of the war into the future, and it saw a danger there. He understood, standing in that camp, that a day would come when people would try to deny that this had happened, that the very enormity of it, the very fact that it strained belief, would one day be used as a weapon against the truth, that liars would stand up in the years and decades to come and claim that all of this had been exaggerated, invented, staged, that it was mere propaganda cooked up by the victors. He saw that future coming, and he decided, on the spot, to make it impossible. That is the order. That is what he did at Ohrdruf that the whole story has been building toward. Standing in that camp, Eisenhower resolved that this would be documented so thoroughly, witnessed by so many, recorded so completely, that no future denial could ever gain a foothold against it. He would bury the lie before it was born under an avalanche of evidence. His reasoning was explicit, and it has been quoted ever since because it is so clear-eyed and so chillingly correct. He explained, in essence, that he had made himself visit the camp deliberately, so that he would be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if there ever developed in the future a tendency to dismiss the allegations as mere propaganda. Read that again and let the foresight of it land. He was not reacting only to the present horror. He was already answering an argument that no one had yet made. The argument that it was all exaggeration, all invention, all a story cooked up by the winning side to blacken the losers. He heard that future lie coming across the years, and he moved to defeat it while he still stood among its victims. It is one thing to be horrified by evil. It is another thing entirely, in the very moment of horror, to have the presence of mind to think about the historians and the deniers and the schoolchildren of a century not yet born, and to act on their behalf. That is what Eisenhower did. In the middle of the worst thing he had ever seen, part of his mind was already standing guard over the memory of it, and he acted on it immediately, in several ways at once. First, he ordered that American soldiers in the area who were not needed on the front lines be brought to the camp to see it for themselves. He wanted the ordinary fighting men to witness what they had been fighting against. There is a thought he expressed in those days that has echoed ever since. The idea that people sometimes said the American soldier did not really know what he was fighting for, and that now, at last, he would at least know what he was fighting against. Eisenhower wanted that knowledge planted in as many minds as possible, firsthand, unmediated, thousands of individual witnesses who could, for the rest of their lives, say that they had stood in that place and seen it themselves. There was a deep strategic wisdom hidden inside that simple order to bring the soldiers through. A photograph can be doubted by a determined doubter. A film can be called staged by someone who wants badly enough to disbelieve it. But a human being who has stood in a place, smelled it, seen it with his own eyes, and carries the memory in his own body for the rest of his life, that is a witness who cannot be argued away, and who will pass his testimony on to his children and his grandchildren as something he personally knew to be true. Eisenhower was creating tens of thousands of such witnesses on purpose, scattering them back across America when the war ended, each one a living, breathing, unshakable rebuttal to any future claim that it had not happened. He understood that memory carried in people is one of the most durable things there is, more durable in some ways than any document, because it renews itself in each generation through the ones who were told by someone who was there. He was seeding the future with truth-tellers, and it worked. For decades afterward, the men who had been marched through those camps as young soldiers spoke of it, taught it, refused to let it be softened or denied, because they had been made to see it and could never again pretend otherwise. Second, he set in motion the recording of the evidence. He wanted photographers and film crews to document everything, to capture on film and in photographs the reality of the camp, exactly as it was found, so that there would exist a permanent, visual, undeniable record. The images that came out of Ohrdruf and the camps liberated in the days and weeks that followed, the newsreels shown in theaters, the The photographs printed in newspapers around the world were not an accident of history. They were, in significant part, the direct result of a deliberate decision by the Supreme Commander that this had to be captured and preserved and shown. And Ohrdruf, terrible as it was, turned out to be only the first. In the days and weeks after that 12th of April, as the Allied armies pushed deeper into a collapsing Germany, they overran camp after camp, each revealing the same machinery of death on scales that grew more staggering with each discovery. Larger camps, more infamous names, were liberated by American and British and other Allied forces across that April and into May, and each one added its own mountain of evidence to the record Eisenhower had ordered built. What had been, at Ohrdruf, a single shocking revelation became, over those weeks, an overwhelming and undeniable pattern. The same horror repeated across a whole continent, documented at each site by the cameras and the witnesses and the reporters that Eisenhower's decision had set in motion. The policy he established at Ohrdruf, see it, record it, bring witnesses, force the world to look, became the template applied at every camp that followed. By the time the war in Europe ended, the Allies had assembled not a single account that could be argued with, but a vast, interlocking, continent-wide body of proof gathered systematically, exactly as one man had ordered when the first gate swung open. Third, and this is the stroke that reveals the full scope of his thinking, Eisenhower reached back across the ocean to the United States itself. He sent word to Washington urging that delegations be brought over to see the camps in person. Members of Congress, prominent editors and journalists, respected public figures. He wanted the leadership of American society and the American press to come to Germany, walk through these camps with their own feet, and then go home and tell the American people what they had seen with the full weight of their own credibility behind it. He was building deliberately a body of witnesses whose testimony could never be dismissed. Lawmakers, newspapermen, soldiers, film, photographs, all pointing at the same undeniable truth from every direction at once. And there was a fourth thing, aimed not at the future, but at the German people themselves, and it was perhaps the most confronting of all. Eisenhower and his commanders ordered that German civilians from the surrounding towns, the ordinary people who had lived their lives in the shadow of these camps, be brought to see what had been done in their midst. At Ohrdruf and at other camps, local townspeople were marched through, made to look at the dead, and in some cases, made to help bury them with their own hands. The Americans would not allow the civilian population to retreat into the comfortable claim that they had known nothing, seen nothing, been responsible for nothing. They forced them to confront it directly, and the confrontation was, for some, unbearable in the most literal sense. There is the grim, well-remembered account that after the mayor of the town of Ohrdruf and his wife were made to tour the camp and see what had been done so close to their home, the two of them went back to their house and took their own lives. Whatever one makes of that, it stands as a measure of how impossible it became once you had actually seen it to hold on to the lie that it had not happened. The decision to force the local civilians to look was, in its way, another act of foresight, aimed at a different kind of denial. Eisenhower and his commanders understood that in the years to come, the people who had lived beside these camps would be tempted, collectively as a nation, to insist that they had not known, had not seen, had not been part of it. It is one of the oldest human reflexes to look away from the crime committed in your name and then to claim you never saw it. By marching the townspeople through the camps at gunpoint of conscience, by making them walk among the dead, and in some cases dig the graves with their own hands, the Americans made that particular evasion much harder to sustain. These were not soldiers or officials of the regime. They were ordinary residents of ordinary towns, and they were being made to confront in the most direct and undeniable way what had been done just down the road from their homes, their shops, their churches. The point was not cruelty for its own sake. The point was truth, to burn into the memory of the local population, and through them, the wider nation, the reality of what had happened, so that it could not later be smoothed over into something vague and deniable. It was the same instinct that drove every other order Eisenhower gave that day. Make people see, so that no one can ever say they did not know. Now step back and see what Eisenhower actually accomplished with those orders, because it is one of the quietest and most consequential victories of the entire war. The liberation of the Nazi camps became one of the most thoroughly documented events in all of human history. There are the films, there are the photographs, there is the testimony of thousands upon thousands of American soldiers who were brought to see the camps firsthand. There is the record left by the congressional delegations and the journalists who came at Eisenhower's urging and reported to the world. There is the forced witness of the German civilians. Layer upon layer of evidence gathered deliberately, precisely because one man, standing in a camp in April of 1945, had the foresight to understand that the truth would one day be attacked, and the will to armor it against that attack before it ever came. And he was right. He was exactly right. In the decades since, there have indeed arisen those who deny that these things happened, or who try to shrink them, or twist them, or wave them away as exaggeration and propaganda, the very charge Eisenhower foresaw, almost word for word, standing in that camp. And they have failed. They have failed not because the truth defends itself, because it does not. The truth is often fragile, and lies are often strong. They have failed because Eisenhower made the truth of the camps into something that cannot be moved. A mountain of film and photographs and first-hand testimony so vast and so consistent and so cross-checked that no honest person can look at it and doubt. He fought a battle against a future enemy, the lie, before that enemy had even fully taken the field. And he won it, decades in advance, on the 12th of April, 1945, by refusing to look away and by ordering the world to look with him. The proof of how well he succeeded came soon and then kept coming. When the leaders of the Nazi regime were brought to trial after the war, the evidence gathered at the camps, the films, the photographs, the documentation Eisenhower had ordered became part of the case laid before the world, shown in the courtroom, so that the crimes could be established as a matter of formal, permanent record, judged in the open with the whole world watching. The visual record was so overwhelming that the reality of the camps was placed beyond serious dispute at the very moment the world was formally reckoning with what had been done. And in the long decades since, that same body of evidence has stood as an unbreakable wall. Museums have been built on it. Historians have spent lifetimes cataloging it. Survivors added their own testimony to it while they lived. And every attempt to deny or diminish the truth has broken against it because the evidence is simply too vast, too varied, too consistent, and too thoroughly cross-witnessed to be honestly denied. That wall did not build itself. Its foundation was laid by a man standing in the first camp, who looked at the horror and in the same breath looked at the future and decided that the future would not be allowed to forget. So what do we take from Ohrdruf and from the man who walked through it forcing himself to see? There is a lesson here about a kind of courage we do not talk about enough. We are used to celebrating the courage of the charge, the soldier who runs toward the guns, the general who dares the bold stroke. That courage is real, and this channel exists in part to honor it. But there is another kind of courage, quieter and in some ways harder, and Eisenhower showed it at Ohrdruf. The courage to witness, the courage to make yourself look at the thing that even the toughest man in the room cannot bear to see, and to keep looking, and to take it fully into yourself rather than flinch away into the mercy of not knowing. Patton, who could face any army on earth, could not face this, and there is no dishonor in that. It was a deeply human response to an inhuman thing, but Eisenhower understood that someone had to be able to say, forever after, "I was there, and I saw it, and I will testify." He appointed himself that witness, and then he multiplied himself into thousands and millions of witnesses, so that the testimony could never be silenced. And underneath the courage, there was wisdom, the rare, forward-looking wisdom to understand that winning the war was not enough, that the memory of the war would be contested ground long after the shooting stopped, and that the truth of what had happened had to be secured as deliberately as any objective on any map. Most people in that moment of horror and grief and rage would have been consumed by the present. Eisenhower, in the middle of it, was already fighting for the future. He understood that the last battle of this war would not be fought against the German army at all. It would be fought against forgetting and against denial, and against the human temptation to look away from what is too terrible to hold. And he made sure, before he ever left that camp, that when that final battle came, the truth would already be dug in, fortified, and impossible to overrun. That is why we still know, not by accident, by the decision of a man who forced himself to look. And perhaps that is the deepest thing Ohrdruf has to teach us all these years later. It is easy, when confronted with something unbearable, to grant ourselves the small mercy of turning away, to decide that we do not need to see it, that knowing about it in a vague and distant way is enough, that the details are too much for us. That reflex is deeply human, and it is exactly the reflex that lets terrible things be forgotten and eventually denied. Eisenhower refused himself that mercy. He made himself look at the full reality when he did not have to, when the toughest man beside him could not, because he understood that someone in a position of authority had to be able to bear witness without flinching, and that the act of witnessing was itself a moral duty. And then he did something even harder than looking. He took responsibility for making sure others would look too, and would keep looking long after he was gone. He turned his own act of witness into a permanent institution of memory, the courage to see and the responsibility to make others see. Those are not the loud virtues of the battlefield, but at Ohrdruf they mattered as much as any charge in the whole war, because an army can win a war and still lose the truth of it if no one has the courage to look the horror in the face and the wisdom to nail that truth down before the liars arrive. Eisenhower did both, and the memory he protected is, in the most literal sense, still doing its work today, in every classroom where this is taught, in every museum where it is preserved, in every honest reckoning with what human beings are capable of when they decide that some lives do not count. That is why we still know, and knowing, we owe it to the dead not to look away either. The witness Eisenhower began does not end with him. It passes to everyone who learns this and chooses to remember and refuses to let it be softened or denied. In that sense, every person who takes this story into themselves becomes one more of the witnesses he set out to create. That was always the plan. He simply started it and trusted the rest of us to keep it going, which is a trust worth honoring and one this channel intends to. Now I want to hear from you, though I know this is a heavier one than most. Had you known the story of how the liberation of the camps came to be so completely documented that it was, in large part, a deliberate act of foresight by Eisenhower himself, rather than something that simply happened? Tell me in the comments what this story stirred in you. And if you have ever visited one of these sites or known a veteran who helped liberate one, share that too, because bearing witness is exactly what Eisenhower asked of us, and it did not end in 1945. If you believe these things must be remembered, and remembered accurately, then do me the quiet favor of hitting the like button. It genuinely helps carry this story to people who need to hear it, which matters more with this one than with almost anything else we do. And if you are not yet subscribed, the next story could not be more different in tone, and you will not believe it is true. It is the story of the single strangest battle of the entire war, the one day near the very end when American soldiers and German soldiers threw down their enmity and fought side by side, together against a common enemy, to defend a castle full of prisoners. It really happened. Subscribe so you're here when we tell it. Thanks for watching.